There is a particular kind of silence that settles into a house when love has slowly been replaced by obligation. It doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in layers. First, the unanswered calls, then the shortened visits, then the sighs that fill the spaces where conversations used to live. I know that silence better than I know the sound of my own voice. I lived inside it for 3 years before I finally decided to write the letter that would change everything, the letter my daughter Destiny never expected to find, and the one that cracked her open in ways I never could have anticipated. My name is Gloria. I am 63 years old, and for the last 5 years of my life, I have been watching my daughter move through her days as though I were a piece of furniture she no longer had the room for, but couldn't quite figure out how to throw away. I say this not with bitterness, though there were bitter years, believe me, but with the kind of clarity that only comes when you have sat with something long enough to understand it fully. And I have sat with this. Lord knows, I have sat with it. To understand where Destiny and I ended up, you have to understand where we began. We were not always two women pulling in opposite directions. There was a time, a long, beautiful time, when we were everything to each other. I raised Destiny alone in a small house in a city where the summers were long and the winters were relentless, where the kind of poverty we knew wasn't dramatic, but it was persistent. Like a low hum, you eventually stopped noticing, because stopping would mean admitting how exhausted you truly were. Her father, Marcus, left when she was 4 years old and never came back in any way that mattered. Not financially, not emotionally, not in any of the ways that would have helped either of us. It was just the two of us from the time she was small, and I want you to understand that I didn't experience that as tragedy. I experienced it as purpose. I worked 2 jobs for most of her childhood. During the week, I cleaned offices downtown, and on weekends, I took in alterations and tailoring work from a woman named Mrs. Patterson, who ran a little fabric shop near the church we attended. I was never home enough, and I knew it, and it is the one thing about those years that I carry with real weight in my chest. But I made sure that whenever I was home, I was fully present. I read to Destiny every single night until she was old enough to read to me. We cooked together on Sunday mornings, elaborate breakfasts that took far too long and dirtied every pan in the kitchen. We laughed. We argued about small things and made up quickly. We told each other everything. I put her through college. Not easily and not without sacrifice, but I did it. I took on extra shifts the entire 4 years she was away, lived on almost nothing, and felt prouder walking across that campus on her graduation day than I had ever felt about anything in my life. Destiny graduated with a degree in business administration, got a good job within 3 months, and within 2 years had moved into an apartment in a neighborhood that felt a whole world away from where she'd grown up. I was happy for her. I want to be very clear about that. I was genuinely, completely happy for her, because her having more than I had was the entire point of everything I had done. What I did not anticipate, what no parent ever seems to fully anticipate, no matter how many times they are warned, was that the distance between her world and mine would grow in ways that had nothing to do with geography. The first time I felt it, we were having dinner at a restaurant she'd chosen, somewhere sleek and expensive, and I made a comment about the portion sizes being too small for the price, and she laughed, but the laugh had an edge to it. A small embarrassment, something she was trying to swallow but couldn't quite manage. It was such a tiny moment. I almost missed it. But I am a woman who has paid attention to small things my entire life, because small things are very often where the truth is hiding, and I noticed it, and something in me went very still. After that, I started noticing other things. The way she would sometimes answer my calls with a kind of performative cheerfulness, as though she were running through a script. The way she stopped asking me about my days with any real curiosity. The way holiday visits began to feel scheduled rather than anticipated, precisely organized slots of time that she was fulfilling rather than inhabiting. And then the comments started. Small ones at first, almost gentle. "Mom, you really don't need to bring food every time you come. I have a grocery store." Or, "Mom, I can't talk right now. I told you to text first." or the one that lodged itself somewhere deep and stayed. Mom, I just need you to understand that my life is very different from yours, and sometimes the things you say don't really apply to my situation. She never said I was a burden. I want to make sure I am telling this with complete honesty. She never said those words. But there are things people communicate that they never put into language. And what I began to understand, slowly and with great pain, was that I had somehow become something destiny managed rather than someone she chose. I was the obligation in her life, the thing she felt guilty about, the woman from another time who didn't quite fit into the shape of the life she was building. And here is what I did with that understanding for longer than I should have. I shrank. I stopped calling as often. I started pre-apologizing for my own presence. I would visit and spend the entire time trying to be smaller, quieter, less demanding of space. I didn't mention money when I was struggling. I didn't mention my health when the arthritis in my hands got bad enough that I was dropping things. I performed wellness and contentment and asked her about her life with the enthusiasm of someone who had entirely set aside their own, because I had decided, unconsciously but completely, that the version of me that didn't need anything was the version she could tolerate. If you are sitting somewhere reading this and you recognize what I am describing, I need you to pause here. I need you to really pause here, because what I just described is one of the most devastating things a parent can do, and I did it with love. I did it because I loved her so much that I was willing to disappear for her. And that is not love sustaining a relationship. That is love destroying one, slowly, from the inside, while looking exactly like sacrifice. The year I turned 61 was the year my body started refusing the arrangement I had made with it. I had ignored small warning signs for too long. The fatigue that wouldn't lift, the occasional dizziness, the way certain tasks exhausted me in ways they hadn't before. My doctor, a young woman named Dr. Serrano, who had the manner of someone who believed in delivering truth kindly but completely, sat across from me in her office and told me I had a cardiac condition that required monitoring, medication, and significant lifestyle changes. She also told me that stress was a serious factor I needed to address. I drove home from that appointment and I sat in my kitchen for a long time without turning the lights on. It was 4 p.m, and the light coming through the window was that particular late autumn shade of gold that always made me think of endings, and I sat there thinking about my life with a kind of thoroughness I hadn't allowed myself before. I thought about what I had built and what I had not built. I thought about the years of work, the years of solitude, the years of joy, and the years of that particular grief that comes from watching someone you love treat you as optional. And then I did something I had not planned to do. I got out a pad of paper and I started writing. I did not set out to write a letter to destiny. I want to be accurate about this. I started by writing to no one in particular, the way you do when you are trying to understand something by putting it outside of yourself. But somewhere in the second page, I realized I was writing to her. That everything I was putting down was something I needed her to know. And once I understood that, I didn't stop. I wrote for 3 hours. I filled 12 pages. And when I was done, I read it back to myself once, folded it, put it in an envelope, wrote her name on the front, and put it in the drawer of my bedside table with the intention of giving it to her. Someday, when the moment was right, the moment never felt right. That is the truth of it. Every time I thought about giving it to her, something in me would pull back. What if it made things worse? What if she felt accused? What if she put it down after the first page and handed it back to me with that careful, managed expression she sometimes wore when she was trying not to show impatience? The letter stayed in the drawer for 14 months. I added to it occasionally. I revised small things. And gradually it stopped being something I planned to give her and became something I simply held on to. Evidence, maybe, that the things I felt were real, that they had existed, that my experience of this time in my life had been witnessed at least by me. What happened next was not dramatic in the way that dramatic things are usually described. There was no fight, No falling out, no single rupture that could be pointed to as the reason. What happened was that I got sick. The cardiac situation I had been managing quietly became unmanageable one Tuesday morning when I was at home alone, and I had to call an ambulance, and I spent 4 days in the hospital. And Destiny didn't know for 2 of those days because I had instructed the neighbor who found me, a woman named Mrs. Freeman, who has been looking in on me twice a week for years and who is one of the genuinely good people in this world, not to call Destiny immediately. I needed to be stabilized. I didn't want her to panic. These were the reasons I told myself, and they were true. But they were not the whole truth. The whole truth was that I had gotten so accustomed to managing myself alone that my first instinct in a crisis was still to protect her from needing to deal with me. When Destiny did find out, when Mrs. Freeman finally called her on the 3rd day because she could not in good conscience wait any longer, my daughter drove to that hospital in under 2 hours. She walked into my room and I saw something on her face that I hadn't seen directed at me in a long time. Not the managed patience, not the performed cheerfulness, raw, genuine, unguarded fear. She sat down next to my bed and took my hand and didn't say anything for a little while, and I watched her trying to compose herself, and I felt something shift in the room between us, though I couldn't have named it yet. She stayed for 2 days. She went home and came back. She spoke with my doctors. She organized my prescriptions and set up follow-up appointments and did all of the logistical things she is extraordinarily capable of doing. And then, on the morning she was preparing to drive home, she stood in my bedroom doorway and said something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. She said, "Mom, why didn't you call me yourself? Why is it always Mrs. Freeman?" And I looked at her and I said, "Because I didn't want to be a burden, baby." The silence after that sentence was the longest of either of our lives, I think. She left shortly after. We hugged at the door, and it was a real hug, the kind we hadn't shared in years, where you can feel the other person actually holding on. And she drove away, and I went inside and lay down on my bed because I was still tired in a way that went beyond the hospital stay. And that was when I remembered the letter. I don't know what made me take it out of the drawer that day. I don't know what made me carry it to the kitchen table and sit with it, but I did. And I read it again, all 12 pages of it, for the first time in months. And when I finished, I put it back in the envelope and I addressed it to Destiny, and the next morning I mailed it to her. No explanation, no note attached. Just the envelope with her name on it in my handwriting, arriving in her mailbox 2 days later on a Thursday afternoon. What was in that letter? I have asked myself many times whether I should share it, whether the words belong to just the 2 of us, or whether they belong to every mother and daughter who have found themselves on opposite sides of a silence they don't know how to cross. I have decided that some of it belongs to everyone, because the things I wrote are things that needed to be said in every house where love has been replaced by management, in every relationship where one person has made themselves smaller to fit inside the space the other has assigned them. I told her the truth about my childhood, which she knew in outline but not in depth. I told her about my mother, a woman named Ruth who raised 5 children with a fierceness that left very little room for tenderness, and how I had spent my entire adult life trying to give Destiny the softness I had never received, sometimes getting it right, and sometimes getting it very wrong. I told her that the greatest fear of my life had never been poverty or illness or loneliness, but the fear that she would grow up and look at me the way I sometimes caught myself almost looking at my own mother, with a love that had hardened into something more like duty. I told her that I had seen that shift happening between us and had chosen to say nothing because I was afraid that naming it would make it permanent. I told her about the years of working 2 jobs, not to generate sympathy, but because she deserved to know the full texture of those years, the specific weight of them. I told her about the winter when I couldn't pay the heating bill and told her the furnace was acting up so she wouldn't be frightened, and how I slept in my coat for 11 days until I got my next paycheck. I told her about the graduation day, how I had stood in that crowd watching her walk across the stage and cried in a way I hadn't cried since her birth, not because I was sad, but because joy of that magnitude has no other outlet. And then I told her the harder things. I told her that I had noticed, gradually and unmistakably, that she had begun to experience me as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be known. I did not say this with accusation. I was very careful about that because the letter was not written to wound her but to reach her. But I said it clearly, because it was true and because I had earned the right to the truth by spending 3 years swallowing it. I told her what it felt like to pre-edit every conversation, to monitor my own needs before expressing them, to arrive at her apartment already apologizing for being there. I told her that I understood she was busy and that her life had demands I probably couldn't fully appreciate. And then I told her that understanding those things did not make the loneliness smaller. I told her about the cardiac diagnosis, everything about it, clearly and without minimizing, the way I had never told her in person because I had convinced myself she had enough to carry. I told her that withholding it had not been wisdom or consideration. It had been a kind of cowardice dressed up as protection, and I was ashamed of it. And then I told her something I had never said to her directly, not once in her adult life, because I had been afraid of how it might sound, afraid she would receive it as pressure or guilt. I told her that I was lonely, not as a complaint, not as an accusation, but as a simple fact about my life that she deserved to know. I told her that the house I lived in was quiet in a way that had gone from peaceful to hollow over the years. I told her that some evenings the silence was so complete that I would turn on the television not to watch anything, but simply to have the sound of human voices in the room. I told her that I loved her life, her independence, her ambition, everything she had made of herself, and that I would never ask her to diminish any of it. And I told her that loving her life didn't mean I had stopped needing her. The last page of the letter, the 12th page, the one I had written last and revised the most, was the one where I told her what I actually wanted from her. Not what I would settle for, not the managed-down version of my needs that I'd been presenting to her for years. What I actually, genuinely wanted. I wanted her to call me sometimes, not because she had scheduled it or remembered it was something she was supposed to do, but because she thought of something she wanted to tell me. I wanted to have the kind of conversations we used to have, where nothing was off limits and both of us were fully present. I wanted to be in her life in a real way, not as a task, not as an obligation, not as someone to be organized and managed, but as her mother, as a person she still chose to know. And then I wrote the thing that surprised even me when I read it back. I wrote that if she could not give me those things, if the distance between her life and mine had grown too large to bridge, if the person she had become genuinely had no room for me in the way I needed, then I could find a way to accept that. It would break my heart, but I would survive it because I had survived everything else. What I could not survive, I told her, was the in-between. The version of our relationship we had been living, where she showed up enough to keep the guilt at bay, but not enough to actually fill the space her absence had left. That half-presence was not enough for me, and I was done pretending it was. I signed it with my full name, not Mom or Mama or any of the names she had called me. Gloria. Because I wanted her to understand that I was a person writing to her, not just a role. She called me the night after she would have received it. I know it was the night she received it because she called at 9:30 in the evening, which was not a time she ever called, and when I answered, she didn't say hello. She just said, "I'm reading your letter." "I know," I said. "I'm not done." "Take your time." She was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear her breathing, and then she said, "Mom, you slept in your coat for 11 days?" And I laughed, which surprised both of us. "Yes, baby, I did." She didn't say anything else right then. She said she would call me tomorrow, and she did. She called me the next morning early, and we talked for 2.5 hours. It was the longest conversation we had had in years, and it was not an easy conversation. Destiny is not a woman who cries easily, but she cried during that call, and so did I, and neither of us tried to manage the other's emotion or rush past the hard parts. She told me things she had never told me, that she had been afraid for years, that she was becoming her mother, that she had been working so hard to build a different life that she had not realized she was also building a wall, and that part of the reason she had begun to keep me at a distance was because being close to me reminded her of everything she was afraid of becoming and everything she was afraid of losing. That last part took courage to say. I want her to know, in case she is reading this, that it took real courage. She also told me, and this is the part I did not expect, that she had been aware, on some level, that she had been treating me the way she had been treating me, not consciously, not with intention. But she said there had been moments where she caught herself and felt something she couldn't name, a discomfort she had pushed away rather than examined. She said reading the letter was like finally letting herself look at that thing directly. And what she saw when she looked at it was not the person she wanted to be. I did not rush to reassure her. That is perhaps the thing I am proudest of in that conversation. My instinct for so many years had been to smooth things over, to get to the part where everything was okay, to prioritize her comfort over the truth of what I was feeling. This time, I let it sit. I said, I know. I knew you knew somewhere. That's part of why I wrote it down. And she said, I'm sorry, Mom. And I said, I know you are. And I'm sorry, too, for not saying this sooner, for making myself smaller, for pretending I was fine when I wasn't. We both got here together. That conversation was 8 months ago. I want to tell you what 8 months looks like, because I think people sometimes imagine that a moment of breakthrough means everything after it is easy. And that is not how life works. 8 months later, Destiny and I are not perfect. We are better, genuinely, measurably, in my body better. But we are also two women who spent years developing habits of distance and avoidance, and habits do not disappear because you have named them. They have to be replaced, slowly and deliberately, with different habits. We are doing that work. Some weeks it is easier than other weeks. She calls me now, not on a schedule, or not only on a schedule, but because something happens during the day and she thinks of me, or because she is making a decision and she wants my perspective, or sometimes, honestly, just because it is a Tuesday and she felt like hearing my voice. The first time that happened, the first time she called me on an ordinary Tuesday for no reason other than to talk, I hung up the phone and stood in my kitchen and pressed both hands to my chest because the feeling was so enormous I didn't know what else to do with it. She came to visit 2 months ago and stayed for a full weekend, not a scheduled, organized slot of time. A weekend where we stayed up past midnight on Friday talking about things we hadn't talked about in years, where we cooked together on Saturday morning and dirtied every pan in the kitchen exactly the way we used to, where she told me about the parts of her life that were hard and didn't ask me to fix them, just let me know. On Sunday afternoon, we sat on my porch for a long time without talking, and it was the good kind of silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled because the people inside it feel safe. I have thought a great deal in these 8 months about why the letter worked when all those years of suffering quietly did not. I think I know the answer, and I think it matters enough to say directly. Silence does not protect the people you love. Silence protects the story you have agreed to tell. I had agreed to tell a story in which I was fine, in which my needs were minimal, in which my love for Destiny was so selfless that it required nothing in return. And Destiny had agreed to tell a story in which she was busy and her mother was okay, and the distance between them was just a natural feature of adult life. We were both, in our own ways, living inside a fiction. And fictions, no matter how lovingly constructed, eventually become cages. The letter was not the words on the page. The letter was me, finally, refusing to stay inside the cage. It was me saying, here is the truth. Here is the full truth. And I am giving it to you not because I want to hurt you, but because I love you too much to keep pretending. There is something I want to say to the women who might be reading this, the mothers and the daughters both, because both sides of this story are real to me, and I have tried in these 8 months to understand Destiny's side as fully as I understand my own. If you are a mother who is making yourself smaller, who is pre-apologizing for your presence, who has decided that the version of you that doesn't need anything is the version that gets to be loved, I need you to hear me. You are not protecting your child by disappearing. You are teaching them, without knowing it, that your needs are not real, that your feelings are optional, that you can be loved completely without being truly known. And that is not the lesson either of you needs to learn. Write the letter. Have the conversation. Not to wound, not to guilt, but to be real. To be fully, honestly present in your own life and in theirs. And if you are a daughter who is reading this, if any part of Destiny's story lives in you, if you have felt that pull toward distance, that complicated mix of love and guilt and the desire to build something separate from where you came from, I am not here to judge you. I understand you better than you might expect. The drive to make your life different is not betrayal. The distance that sometimes grows between children and parents is not always cruelty. But I'm asking you to look honestly at the line between necessary distance and avoidance. I am asking you to consider what it might mean to your mother, to the woman who built herself around loving you, to be managed rather than chosen. And I am asking you to ask yourself, before it is too late, when did you last call her, not because you were supposed to, but because you wanted to? I am 63 years old. My heart has known extraordinary things. It has known the specific, fierce love that arrives when you hold your child for the first time and understand, all at once, that you would lay down everything for this person without a second thought. It has known grief and loneliness and the long stretches of ordinary days that make up most of a life. It has known the particular pain of loving someone who has stopped seeing you. And it has known, recently, and more fully than I expected, what it feels like to be seen again by the person whose opinion has always mattered most to me. Destiny told me something last month that I have been turning over ever since. She said, "Mom, the hardest part of reading that letter was realizing that the person you described was someone I would never accept being treated that way by anyone else. If a friend of mine was treated that way, I would be furious. I would tell her she deserved better, and you were tolerating it from me. I told her I was tolerating it because I loved you. She said, I know, and I'm going to spend a long time figuring out how to deserve that. I told her she already did. I told her we both had some figuring out to do, and we would do it together, and that was enough. That is enough. Mrs. Freeman came by last week. She comes most weeks now, not because I need her to check on me, but because we have become genuine friends in the way that sometimes happens later in life, when you stop having the energy to maintain relationships that aren't real. We sat on my porch and drank tea, and she asked me how things were with Destiny. I told her things were good, really good. She looked at me for a moment and said, "You look different, Gloria. You look like yourself again." I thought about that on the walk back inside. I thought about what it means to look like yourself, to inhabit your own face fully, without apology, without management, without the subtle performance of smallness that I had been so accustomed to that I'd stopped noticing I was doing it. I thought about all the years I had spent shrinking and all the energy that takes and what it feels like to stop. What it feels like is like breathing. If you have read this far, I want to thank you for staying with me. I know this is not a short story. It is not a tidy story. It does not have a resolution that wraps everything neatly, because lives don't work that way, and I have no interest in telling you otherwise. What it has is truth. What it has is two women who love each other finding their way back to each other, imperfectly and slowly, and with a great deal of honesty that was overdue. The letter is still in my bedside drawer. Destiny knows I kept a copy, and she told me she kept hers, folded, in the back of a journal she's had since college. She said she takes it out sometimes, not to reread it, but just to hold it, to remember the moment her mother handed her the truth and trusted her to be big enough to receive it. I think that is one of the most loving things anyone has ever said to me. I want to leave you with something I have been thinking about since that first long phone call 8 months ago. Destiny said to me, somewhere in the middle of it, "Mom, why didn't you just tell me?" And I thought about it before I answered, really thought about it, and what I said was this: because I was afraid of what would happen if I did, and because I had gotten so good at not telling you that I had forgotten I was making a choice. That last part is the thing I keep coming back to, the thing I want you to take from this story if you take nothing else. When you stop telling the people you love what you actually need, you do not stop making choices. You simply stop noticing that you're making them. And one day you find yourself sitting in a dark kitchen in the late afternoon light, 61 years old and recently diagnosed and profoundly lonely, and you realize that the distance between you and the person who matters most to you is not something that happened to you. It is something you participated in, quietly and with the best intentions, for years. The good news, and there is good news, I want to be very clear about that, is that the same hands that built the wall can take it down. Not all at once. Brick by brick, word by word, phone call by phone call, Sunday morning by Sunday morning, with a pan of eggs and every other pan in the kitchen and no apology for the mess. That is the story of my daughter and me. That is the story of the letter I almost never sent, and the 12 pages that said everything I had spent 3 years not saying, and the phone call that came in at 9:30 at night from a woman who was not finished reading but needed to hear my voice anyway. That is the story of how I stopped shrinking, and how, in stopping, I made room for her to step back in. If this story moved you in any way, if you heard your mother in my voice, or yourself in Destiny's, or if you have a letter you have been carrying around in a metaphorical drawer for years, I want to hear from you in the comments. Tell me your story. Tell me who you need to send the letter to. Tell me what you have been holding on to and what you wish someone would say out loud. I read every single comment, and I write back when I can, because I believe that the most powerful thing any of us can do is refuse to be alone with the things that are hardest to say. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. There is a mother somewhere who is making herself smaller right now. There is a daughter somewhere who has not called in too long and feels a guilt she can't quite look at directly. There is a family somewhere on the edge of a silence that will harden if someone doesn't step forward. Maybe sharing this is the thing that steps forward. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because I intend to keep telling the truth as long as I am here to tell it. I have spent too many years being quiet. I find, at 63, with a heart that has been through a great deal and is still beating, that I am finished with quiet. My name is Gloria. I am my mother's daughter and my daughter's mother and the author of a 12-page letter that changed both of our lives. And I am just getting started.